Okay. So justification and normative justification going to, in the end, appeal to moral reasoning. So normative justification. Normative justification refers to just basically our the necessity of providing reasons for that justify our claims about the validity of our principles. Just as we have to provide justification for any kind of empirical claim, providing facts and evidence for our empirical claims, we also need to provide reasons for our moral claims, or in particular our claims about justice. We have to provide, and justification is about providing reasons, valid reasons that would justify our principles. So not only, so the question arises then, on what basis can we justify our principles? What is the foundation of that justification? What is the rational what is the rational basis of our justification of our principles? So not only, and our political values as well. So on one level we have political principles of justice and values that we can identify. And then on a more foundational level, we have the criteria or standards that can be appealed to justify those principles or values. And then above that, we have laws and practices and institutions, which should be consistent with our principles and values that are grounded in and justified by an appeal to certain criteria or a certain set of basic reasons that justify our principles and values. Does that make sense at the outset? So here we're going to think about what are those criteria, what are those standards of justification. Throughout the rest of our work, we'll be considering what should be the principles of justice in various domains, and thinking about those principles or justifying what we think would be right in terms of principle based upon certain criteria of justification. It should be noted that there is no exact moral equation here. This isn't a mathematical equation. It's not something exact, but our criteria and our judgments based upon those criteria are a matter of judgment, a matter of what is reasonable rather than something exact. Or those who believe in moral truth may purport to have an exact moral equation. I suggest that that's beyond human capability. That we can't. It's not a mathematical equation. It's not engineering or science here. It's a little more fuzzy than something that exact, like quantum mechanics and physics. You can predict to 100 decimal places the phenomena. Can't do that in the moral realm, right? In the realm of justice or human society, too many variables, right? Because we have free will and such. So the moral equation is, the standard is one more of reasonable agreement, as we'll see, rather than this is the truth, based upon an exact formula. So we ask, what is the rational basis of the validity of our values, principles, and judgments? That's our basic question here. on what basis can we justify those claims? And there are at least 4 alternatives, and there are more, but these are prominent alternatives. One alternative is an appeal to moral relativism. We each create our own justification. A second alternative, I'll explain these in detail. The second alternative is social acceptance. So moral relativism is it is valid because I believe it is. Social acceptance is my principle is justified because we, the group, the social group, we all accept it. And that acceptance in itself, it is argued, is the rational basis of the validity or justifiability of the principle. A third, which we've already alluded to, alternative is moral truth, a belief in some kind of independent truth about what is right and wrong, good and evil, etc., including principles of justice. And the fourth alternative, the one that we're going to apply here in the course, is moral reasoning, an appeal to moral reasoning, and that's grounded, moral reasoning is grounded in the presuppositions of moral reasoning itself. And those presuppositions turn out at their core to be about fairness, as we'll see. So let's go through these 4 alternatives. The first is moral relativism, and this is fairly common, at least a common initial point of view, that morality, right and wrong, justice is relative to what the individual believes. So I believe in this principle, and because I believe in this principle, and you believe in your principle, those principles are necessarily valid because I and you believe in them. Yes, this is right for me. And therefore it's right for me, therefore it is right. It is right because it's right for me. The basic idea of individual relativism. The values and principles that I affirm are valid because I affirmed them. So one's claims are justified that the belief in the validity of one's own moral principle is sufficient justification. See any problem with this?
It's not like a holistic approach to it.
It's not holistic.
Yeah.
No.
The person believes that they're using to justify like their own experiences and stuff, which is like it can be different,
Yeah.
It's different for like everyone.
Yeah. It's egoistic, right? Mm-hmm. It's solipsistic. It's only me. That I'm important. And you have the same position if you're a moral relativist, right? The problem is that we can't live this way. Right? We can't have a society this way if we all had our own principles of justice and principles of right. Because we would there would be no grounds upon which we could settle those disagreements. There's no basis beyond our own affirmation of the principle. And more basically, justice, thinking about justice and what is right socially, justice is what we are due and what we owe others. Justice, by definition, justice is a consideration not only about ourselves, what our rights might be, but it's also what we owe others. And so justice ultimately is addressed to others. And so moral relativism it is inadequate in that it doesn't take into consideration the other person and what they might believe and whether we can come to any kind of agreement with them. So under relativism, principles of justice would actually lose their capacity to resolve and regulate conflicts in society. And this would lead to a social situation of where power would dominate. The most powerful would dominate others. And that's not just. It's not a situation of justice. Right does not make, might does not make right. So there are significant problems with moral relativism. The second alternative is social acceptance, an appeal to social acceptance. And the argument here is that the values and principles that we affirm are valid because we as a social group accept them. So let's say we're a group, we're a social group, we all accept a set of principles, and we say they're valid because we all agreed to them. We all accepted them. So widely shared and accepted principles are sufficient justification for their validity. If they are widely shared, then they are justifiable. So their validity is grounded in the fact that they are recognized and affirmed by the social group. This method has a clear legitimacy, and as we'll see, social acceptance is necessary, a necessary element of justification, some kind of agreement. But agreement alone, by its standing alone, without identifying the particular conditions under which the agreement was achieved, is insufficient. We could argue is insufficient. If we just based our justification on what we accept, would that be valid? Is that sufficient? Are there instances where principles were widely accepted but turned out to be unjust?
Yeah, that makes me think of the Holocaust, because it was a wide societal, or maybe not all of society, but they wanted to get rid of the Jews. But that doesn't mean the Holocaust was justifiable.
Yeah. Yeah, there was wide acceptance, maybe not for killing, for the murder of Jews and others, but there was wide acceptance for removing them from society in Nazi Germany. Wide anti-Semitism, etc. Have there been cases in our own society where a principle or value was accepted widely and turns out upon reflection to be unjust?
Segregation in the South.
Racial segregation, widely accepted, turns out to be unjust. A principle of racial segregation. Principles of gender inequality, widely accepted, historically accepted, turns out to be upon a more objective, in quotations, objective reflection, impartial reflection, turns out to be unjustifiable, even though they're widely accepted. That's common, right? It's a common occurrence. And this is parallel to empirical empirical beliefs about the world. Whole groups of people can believe in that something is true, and it may not be true. And whole groups of people can believe in that something is right, principle is right, and it can turn out not to be that way. You know, if we were all tonight, if we were all on the beach on the Gulf of Mexico in Florida, and we were watching the sunset across the water, we're standing in the same position, we're looking at the sunset, and the earth looks flat, right? It looks flat. And the sun falls off the horizon. Wow. We could believe that the earth is flat, right? And that could be widely accepted among us. Would it be true? No, we could be wrong. Our acceptance could be wrong. So that's the problem with social mirror. We need some kind of a perspective outside the group, some kind of criterion outside the group in order to determine whether the acceptance is actually justified, or what we accept is actually justified. Does that make sense? Good. So social acceptance, it might be necessary, but it's not sufficient. I discussed those problems. The third alternative is the authority of moral truth. And this is an appeal to moral truth as reasons of justification. So if there's a truth out there, and we can know that truth, then we can appeal to that truth when we seek to justify our principles. That our principles are in line with what is true. And in general, this has been, there are many terms for this, but one of them, a prominent one, is rational intuitionism. And it can turn into fundamentalist beliefs when there is a belief in the absolute certainty of the principle. Then one falls into more of a fundamentalist point of view. Common example of fundamentalism is various religious fundamentalisms. But also you can believe you can be a philosophical fundamentalist as well. This view asserts that there's an objective, pre-existing, universal moral truth that can be comprehended by human cognition. And when comprehended, this moral order provides individuals with justification. This is a belief in an independent moral order, independent of human construction, and it exists independently of us. But we can, or a few of us maybe not all, depending upon the belief, can comprehend that moral truth, that independent moral order. So from this perspective, moral principles are discovered. They're out there, they're in the universe. God created them. Some higher power created them. Or they're just written into the fabric of the universe. And we can go out and discover them, just as we do with science, natural law. We can discover the laws of nature. We can discover the laws of morality. We can know the truth. Wow, what a relief, right? Woo! That makes things a lot simpler. Moses comes down from the mountaintop with the moral truth. Of course, his people were not so receptive at the time. But wow, this is the truth. That's very comforting, right? Wow, we can know the truth. Plato is a famous advocate of moral truth, the authority of moral truth, and in his famous dialogue, The Republic, a must-read, he argues that society, a just society, can only be just if it's grounded, if it's governed in terms of the moral truth. So we can have a just society only if we know what is true in the moral realm. We can have a just society only if our principles of justice are grounded in the truth. And from Plato's perspective, as it turns out, only a few people have the capability to know that moral truth. It's only the philosophers who have access to the truth. To his credit, he suggested that, or argued that a philosopher can come from any walk of life, from any social class, and can be male or female. A radical move for him at the time, for 420 BCE, to include women. And he argued that the philosophers should rule, and the philosopher king and queen should rule, and they should all take a vow of poverty, so that they will not be polluted by self-interest. Pretty admirable. What if our politicians took a vow of poverty? That might be better. It might weed out the corrupt. So this is an appeal. This is a very historically dominant point of view, and millions still believe in moral truth. See any problems with this?
Yeah, like what we were saying earlier.
Yeah.
Gonna believe in spikes and
Right.
truth.
Yeah. One of the problems is if there was a moral truth, wouldn't we all come to an agreement about what the truth is? Eventually, and maybe we do in a very minimal sense, like prohibitions against murder, incest, things like that. But not a full array of principles of justice, do we? Is there agreement on the truth of? Yeah. There's also, if in Plato's case, and this is common in most religions, there's some kind of seer or prophet or sage that has cognized the moral truth, and they give it to the people. There's a problem here is how do we verify that the prophets, sages, seers, philosophers have discovered the truth? On what grounds can we verify that they have discovered the truth? And as we know from science, the truth is elusive and difficult to verify. In fact, you can never, from a scientific point of view, you can never verify with certainty the truth. You can only verify or disconfirm what is not true. And science operates on the grounds of falsification. We test to see if the hypothesis can survive critical scrutiny, whether it stands up, whether it survives falsification. And if it does, then we can provisionally accept it as a viable hypothesis or theory. But it's never with certainty, because tomorrow we could discover some counter evidence, and that could overthrow the theory. So even at the height of scientific discovery is not about truth per se. So how would we go about verifying that someone has the moral truth? That turns out not to be possible. And that's a problem with the authority of moral truth, or our basis for justice. And often, then it devolves into authority. Right? It's true because I say it's true, and I have the power, and you must believe it. Or else, off to the gulag. Right? Or you'll be ostracized in some if you don't follow my. So there are also problems with moral truth. Does that make sense? So where does that leave us? If relativism, social acceptance, and moral truth fail or are inadequate for grounding our principles of justice, where can we turn? Is there any place to turn? We might be stuck here. I think there is a place to turn, and that's an appeal to moral reasoning itself. Moral reasoning itself, because we as human beings have the capability of reasoning. So maybe the key to justifying moral principles or principles of justice is to look to the nature of moral reasoning itself as a possible basis of justification. And this approach was initiated by Immanuel Kant prominently in the 18th century as a part of the European Enlightenment. And this is one approach, one tradition that comes from Kant. So this fourth possibility is the claim that the possibility that justification is grounded in a particular process of moral reasoning. This is articulated by Thomas Scanlon, clearly articulated. Scanlon's a noted philosopher, contemporary philosopher, Harvard professor, who wrote a very important book in this tradition called What We Owe to Others. And in that book, he makes this statement: if we could characterize the method of reasoning through which we arrive at judgments of right and wrong, and could explain why there is good reason to give judgments arrived at in this way the kind of importance that moral judgments are normally thought to have, then we would, I believe, have given sufficient answer to the question of the subject matter of right and wrong. So Scanlon is suggesting that if we could understand this method of reasoning, the method of reasoning through which we arrive, in which we generate judgments about what's right and wrong, if we could characterize that method of reasoning, then we could perhaps find the criteria of justification within the method of reasoning itself. That's very happily that's unhappily abstract. But it's a very interesting idea, as we'll hopefully see. From this perspective, we can look to the nature of reasoning itself. And specifically, we can look to the presuppositions of reasoning for the criteria of justification. So what does moral reasoning presuppose? And I'll explain what that means. But if we can identify the presuppositions of moral reasoning, then that might provide us, those presuppositions might provide us with the criteria of justification. Independently of social acceptance or moral truth or individual relativism. We're not appealing to God here. We're appealing to the nature of our own reasoning, is the idea. So presuppositions. What does that mean? What is a presupposition? Presuppositions, one understanding of them is, in this context, is that they are the constitutive elements of reasoning itself. They define, in the sense that they define what reasoning is. Just as the constitutive rules of a game define what the game is, chess, soccer, baseball, poker, hearts, bridge, whatever the game is defined. The game itself is defined by its rules. You change the rules, you have a different game, right? You change the primary rules. The argument here is that the same is for human reasoning. That human reasoning and moral reasoning in particular is defined by certain aspects or elements. It has defining constitutive elements to it. So these presuppositions are logically necessary if one is to actually engage in a process of reasoning itself. If you reject those presuppositions, then you're not reasoning. You're not engaged in the process of reasoning, you're doing something else. So reasoning is defined in a certain way, by certain elements, necessary elements of reasoning. And this idea of constitutive elements is referred to in the philosophical literature as transcendental. Transcendental in the sense that they go beyond the process itself to something deeper. But it can be noted that presuppositions can be preformative as well, in the sense that if you or I assert a presupposition, if we make an assertion, then by making that assertion, something must follow from it. So if you assert or I assert that equality is a presupposition of justice, that we have to recognize each other as equals, then that presupposition, that assumption, leads to a particular conception of justice, conception of society, a democratic conception of society, if we believe in equality. If our performative presupposition is inequality, that some people are superior to others, that there's a hierarchy of value among humans, then we have a very different, what will follow from that necessarily will be a different conception of justice, and a very different looking society. So, presuppositions can be transcendental, and they can also be performative, is the idea. That makes sense to you? Any questions? This is abstract, right? But I think powerful, can be very powerful. So hang in there. I think you are hanging in there. Yes? You're hanging in there?
Yeah.
Good. So, so there are general normative presuppositions of moral reasoning that we could identify. And then some more specific ones that we'll identify. So one is one presupposition is that the process of justification is one of offering reasons. That's a presupposition. To reason is to offer reasons to others. That's one presupposition. Reasoning is about addressing others, and offering them reasons of justification. A second is that normative reasons of justification are not determined by empirical knowledge of consequences. Moral reasoning can be, therefore, can be understood as an independent type of reasoning, distinct from theoretical and empirical reasoning. The idea here is that normative justification is its own way of reasoning, different from other kinds of reasoning. And that it's not a direct appeal. It does take into account, of course, consequences of action, but it doesn't, it cannot, our ultimate choice, moral choice, cannot be determined by consequence. An example. Say I'm standing on a railroad track, and there's a train coming at a high speed. A train on the track is coming. Should I stay on the track? Or should I step off the track? The consequence, we know the consequences. If I stay on the track, I will be killed. Instantly crushed by the train. And that's a fact, predictable fact. Does that fact alone tell me what is right?
No, it doesn't.
Pardon?
No.
I still have a choice, right? Maybe I want to die. Maybe my life is in the tank. Or maybe I don't want to die. Maybe I want to continue living, so I step off the track. So it's and also, well, would it be right for me to commit suicide? Is another very important consideration, moral consideration. Would it be right for me to take my own life? Those are choices independent of the fact that the train is coming. And those are moral choices and ethical choices of value and principle that are independent. They're independent of the facts. The facts are important, but they can't tell us what is right or wrong in themselves. Science can give us all the facts, and those are very important things. But they can't tell us what choices are justified. That takes another kind of reasoning. So that's the second presupposition. Does that make sense? So here we're dealing with an independent from science and theory, independent way of thinking that is normative. So normative reason is independent in an important, distinguishable way. That's the second presupposition. The third general presupposition is that and we alluded to this already, that moral reasoning is addressed to others. It's addressed to you and to us. When we make claims about what is right as a matter of justice, we are making claims to others that we are in relationship with, that we share a world or society with. So justice is addressed it's addressed to each other, as to everyone. And so when we reason about what is right or what is just, where that reasoning is always addressed to others. It includes ourselves, what we might value, what our own good, and what we have a right to. But it's also about what we owe to others. So that's the third general presupposition. The fourth is that moral justification is grounded in intersubjective mutual understanding and agreement. Not just general agreement, not social acceptance as such, but agreement under certain conditions that we can identify. So that's the fourth presupposition. Because it's addressed to others, it requires mutual understanding and agreement. But under particular normative conditions defined by what others could not reasonably reject, as we'll see. And the fifth general presupposition is, which follows from the fourth, is that it's discursive. Moral reasoning is discursive and it involves discourse with others, dialogue, conversation with others, deliberation, and it's procedural. And I'll explain what that means. So it involves communication and deliberation under specific conditions, and the procedural aspect to moral reasoning refers to these specific normative conditions under which we deliberate. So there are certain, perhaps, procedures of reasoning that have particular characteristics that would provide the conditions under which we can agree. And if the conditions are fair or are right, then whatever we agree to will be justified. And this is referred to as moral constructivism, which comes from Kant and other very prominent thinkers and moral theorists. Moral constructivism that suggests that moral reasoning involves a procedure of construction, a process of justification through deliberation that's structured in terms of particular presuppositional normative criteria. It's fancy language, right? So this procedure of moral reasoning employs normative criteria as acceptable restrictions or constraints on reasons that parties may appeal to in order to justify the validity of their principles. And these standards comprise the standards of normative constraint. So from this perspective, justification is constructed through a procedure of deliberative moral reasoning that employs procedural normative constraints. This is what John Rawls called pure procedural justice. So from this perspective, we do not begin with principles of justice as such. That's not our starting point. That's the end of our deliberation. But we begin with a set of presuppositional normative criteria that define the constraints on the reasons that we can use to justify our principles. And as we'll be discussing, those normative constraints or those presuppositions are the presuppositions of fairness, of what is fair. So from this perspective of moral reasoning, what is just, what is justifiable is what we can agree to, under certain conditions, under the conditions of, as we'll see, fairness. It's analogous to a contract, making a contract, this process of moral reasoning. The contract is only valid if the conditions under which we agree to the contract are justifiable or are fair. If we sign a contract under duress, if we're manipulated or threatened, or we have to sign the contract, then the contract isn't valid. It can be overturned because it was signed under unfair conditions, right? When we go to buy a car, we sign a contract, but if we're buying the car under unfair conditions, then we could void the contract. That's analogous to this process of moral reasoning. So we reason under certain conditions, and those conditions are constraints on what we can offer each other. We have to be consistent with those constraints. Does that make any kind of initial sense to you?
I have a question. Isn't that what they do in court and stuff, like if a person gets a confession under like a certain conditions, like it has to be thrown out?
That's right. That's right. So in the law, the law is parallel to this. Legal proceedings are parallel to. That's why you have a judge there. So the judge makes determinations. He or she makes determinations about what's admissible and what's not, what's fair or not, what can be, and then instructs the jury about what they should consider in their decision making. That's a process of constructivism. So the prosecutor wants to admit evidence, have evidence admitted to the court, but they gathered that evidence through torture or through an unauthorized wiretap, or it was coerced under, torture would be coercion. That violates various standards, criteria of justification that would nullify or refute the claim. So just as in legal reasoning, it's done under certain conditions and procedures. You have to follow the rules, follow the procedure of deliberation. The argument here is that's the same for moral reasoning. And we can identify perhaps those constraints or those procedures, those rules, under which our agreement can occur. And if they're right, then the normative power is transferred from those conditions to our agreement, or our agreement is justifiable because they have occurred under certain conditions. This is true for democracy too. Democracy generally is a procedural kind of justice, in part. So a legislature passes a law, and if we don't agree with the law, we think it's unjust, the first thing we look to, were the procedures followed? Was the decision made under, did they use the right procedures? And that's the first condition. If they didn't follow the correct procedure, then the outcome, the law, is invalid. It's not justifiable because they violated the procedure. Same here, same idea here. So we look to, and we'll discuss this in much greater detail as we proceed. We look to the conditions and the procedures under which reasoning is occurring in order to determine what is justifiable or not. So claims of justice presuppose criteria for the determination of the justifiability of reasons. We could ask then, what normative criteria then form the rational basis of justification? What are those conditions under which deliberation should occur? What are they? We've begged that question so far, right? We haven't answered that question yet. We could argue subsequently that we test the normative validity of our principles by appeal to reasons of fairness. Reasons of fairness that are grounded in and presupposed by basic moral reasoning. So the claim here is, the idea is here is that moral reasoning is grounded in fairness. That the process of reasoning has to be fair in order for it to be valid. And therefore the outcomes of that reasoning must be consistent with fairness in order to be justifiable. So that leads us to the question, well, what is fairness? But that's the basic idea here, and this is what John Rawls called justice as fairness. Rawls was maybe arguably the greatest American philosopher America has produced so far. One of them, at least. And he developed this idea of justice as fairness, in particular in a book called A Theory of Justice. And that revolutionized moral and political philosophy was pretty much dead in the 1950s and 1960s. It was moribund. It had been dominated by utilitarianism for over 100 years, and there wasn't much happening with rethinking that. It kind of had died and been taken over by economics. And Rawls came along in the Kantian tradition and revived the whole field of moral and political philosophy through his work. And at the center of that work was the idea of justice as fairness. His words. So following Rawls, the elements of fairness, what we define what is fair, are the basic criteria for the justification of principles of justice. And Amartya Sen, famous economist and philosopher and Nobel Prize winner for economics, of Indian descent, in his book, The Idea of Justice, makes the following statement. I think it's very powerful about Rawls' contribution. And he writes, perhaps the most far-reaching example of what is essential for an adequate understanding of justice is Rawls' foundational idea that justice has to be seen in terms of the demands of fairness. In this approach, the notion of fairness is taken to be foundational and is meant to be in some sense prior to the development of the principles of justice. I would argue that we have good reason to be persuaded by Rawls that the pursuit of justice has to be linked to and in some sense derived from the idea of fairness. This central understanding is not only important for Rawls' own theory, it is also deeply relevant to most analyses of justice. So Sen is suggesting following Rawls, and Sen disagrees with Rawls on many points, but he agrees with Rawls that the idea of fairness is foundational to justice, to principles of justice. That our thinking about justice, our reasoning about justice, our justification of our principles of justice must be grounded in fairness. And that's the idea I'm adopting here as well. I'm a follower of Rawls. I think it's a very powerful way to think. So that leads us to the question of what is fairness, and what are the criteria of fairness, or the elements of fairness. And I want to argue that there are at least 4 criteria: equality, recognition, reciprocity, and impartiality are the presuppositions of fairness. They define what fairness is. We don't have time to go into those. That's our next step. But at the outset, what do you think fairness is?